Trek to Yomi really confuses me on what it's trying to accomplish. One look at it makes it immediately obvious that it's attempting to be a playable Kurosawa film. And even if you've never seen any of that legendary filmmaker's movies, you'll still recognize his name if you played Ghost of Tsushima, which offered a black and white grainy filter mode to pay homage to this creative director. This might be a bit of a hot take, but I believe that this approach ends up working better in Ghost of Tsushima rather than Trek to Yomi, despite the latter being built with this intent from the project's inception. That's because this newer title leans so heavily into the cinematography and art direction that often the game itself, the mechanics and systems, end up feeling like an afterthought. It leaves you with the sensation that it desperately wants to be a movie, so much so that it's willing to sacrifice or lessen its game design to maintain that initial vision. And for me, sacrificing the elements that make your game a game for the sake of the presentation isn't a wise move. It results in Trek to Yomi being consistent and faithful in its vision to imitate a Kurosawa film, but also confused on what sort of medium it wants to be. In an interview with Seasoned Gamer, Trek to Yomi creator Leonard Menchiari responds to the question, quote, "Was the length of the game a factor you considered when designing Trek to Yomi?" End quote. He responds by saying that it was, as he initially envisioned a game with high replayability, but that ultimately it was scrapped for a single run approach. He goes on to say that despite the game having multiple endings, he can't claim this game to be super replayable. So I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but let me give you his exact quote. He says, quote, "Sure, there are multiple endings. You can fight a bit differently, but there is no sense of progression after finishing the game once. So I suggest just playing it as if you were watching a movie or a short series rather than a standard video game." End quote. And it's the last part of that quote, where he talks about playing the game as if you were watching a movie, that interests me the most. To me, it's clear evidence of this game's confusion on what it wants to be, and it runs counterintuitive to how Menchiari answered a question earlier in the same interview. In regards to game difficulty, Menchiari said, quote, "My approach on difficulty depends on what you're trying to communicate emotionally to the player. During moments of struggles, the player should feel more stressed and threatened, so the difficulty should be higher. While when you want to make the player feel empowered, you should reduce the difficulty to give them more satisfaction. Of course, you can't get enough satisfaction if the challenge isn't there. That's why you need some struggle at times. This is probably one of the hardest things to achieve in this type of art form, so I hope that I'll be able to improve myself continuously on this particular aspect over the years and projects to come." End quote. So, in short, my issue with all of this is that it leaves a lot of hesitation on how to recommend playing this title. There are multiple difficulty options, something that Menchiari said he was hesitant to include, but the result is that it clashes with what the game is trying to accomplish. If I play the game on normal difficulty or above, I'm going to die quite a few times, which creates dissonance with that notion that this is meant to be experienced as a movie or a short series. I mean, I've never seen a movie in which a character dies and gets to respawn as many times as possible to try the fight again. Yet that's going to happen a lot here. The struggles that Menchiari talks about are meant to be felt firsthand in a game, but through an understanding in a movie. You can't have it both ways as much as Trek to Yomi tries to. Because of this, I think it's necessary to separate the game elements from the presentational elements when assessing Trek to Yomi. So let's start with the presentation and storytelling, since these are the more identifiable components that both movies and games share. Trek to Yomi tells the story of Hiroki, a samurai tasked with a heavy responsibility from a very young age. Hiroki learned the Bushido Code as well as the Way of the Samurai from his town's leader starting early in his childhood. One day, his village was raided by bandits and his sensei perished, leaving him as one of the few capable of defending the town. He vows to never leave his people behind, including that of a love interest named Aiko. Flashing years into the future, we play the remainder of the game as the adult version of Hiroki. Trek to Yomi tells the story of how he failed to uphold his promise, how he let his people down, and then of course the path to redemption he takes to prove it to himself and others that he's worthy of being a protector. I don't want to get into story spoiler territory, so that's all I'm gonna say about plot beats. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say that it's quite a simple story that ultimately fails to hook the player with tense moments, interesting characters, or climactic cutscenes that evoke fights found in Kurosawa films. The most prominent part of the story is Hiroki himself. In particular, the intense feelings of guilt he experiences over his failure. We see him break down at various times throughout the game, but he never loses his drive to push onward because of his commitment to being a great samurai and protector. This admirable mindset is what gave me the most enjoyment from this game's story, but at the end of the day, it still wasn't enough to call this narrative one worth experiencing. Unfortunately, most of what we see here goes down a heavily treaded path. And you know, that's a pretty substantial knock against a game that wants to be experienced in the same way that a movie is. This failure to tell a story with any sort of engaging hooks or fresh takes means that much of the title's impressive presentation style feels like a hollow victory. It's like a beautifully wrapped birthday present that just ends up being socks. Regardless, divorced from the rest of the game experience, it's undeniable how much work went into designing this art style and presenting the world to the player using dynamic views and well-choreographed angles. In particular, the grainy effect on top of the black and white filter makes for a nice touch, lending credence to the movie-like feel. Many camera angles seem to be tucked behind environmental objects, which better puts us into the world as if we are one of the terrified townsfolk that Hiroki is protecting. There are many points throughout the game where this works wonderfully, as you're treated to that classic side view of two powerful warriors facing off against one another. Two adversaries, but only one path. One must perish so that the other can progress. It's beautifully done many times throughout, and provides some of the greatest thrills that Trek to Yomi can deliver. But it goes beyond the presentation of the combat, as smart lighting is used to ensure the player rarely gets lost while navigating each level. Levels are linear, but the darkness of the black and white filter could have seen players getting lost frequently if lighting wasn't handled as well as it is. And at the same time, side paths aren't made as obvious to the player, as often there isn't a huge light protruding from them to lure you in like a moth to the flame. It means you'll have to pay a little extra attention to uncover these, but doing so usually leads to nice rewards, like hidden checkpoints, stamina and health upgrades, or ammunition for your ranged attacks. And along with the excellent sound work, the lighting and presentational style comes together to form a very cohesive vision for this game, unlike anything I've seen before. Most of the time, it all flows together smoothly to provide the intended homage to Kurosawa films. However, when the art direction is as pronounced as it is here, any hiccups are going to stand out like a sore thumb, and Trek to Yomi does have quite a few of these moments. Whether it's random bugs that cut out voice lines, or rough transitions between stages of a boss fight, or sometimes occasionally bad lighting that sees you get lost, or even as something as goofy as having Hiroki kill all the enemies, but then refuse to sheath his sword and turn around, leading to this weird moonwalking that's hilariously bad. I can't say I'd expect to see that in a film, and seeing it here in a game that wants to be a film, well, it's just not good. Going further though, there are times when the presentation also hampers the gameplay, such as when extreme angles or environmental objects hinder your viewpoint of the action, leading to damage or death. It's fine when the camera angle is straight on in that side-scrolling way, but as soon as they go in 3D directions or change the view to a higher up angle, it doesn't feel nearly as good to fight. Of course, combat in this game isn't necessarily anything to write home about, despite it being what you'll spend the majority of your time doing. We have a basic melee action game setup here, where your objective is to dodge, block, and especially parry enemy attacks before slashing back at them in short bursts or long combos. Quick enemy recovery times means you can't spam attacks to win, and will have to find balance between offense and defense to progress. At the end of the day though, there's two issues with this combat setup: repetitiveness and how OP parrying is. You can easily get through this game if you learn your parry windows, which are pretty gracious for anyone with decent reaction time. It leads to many instances in which you parry, strike, parry, strike, parry, strike, until all enemies lie on the ground in a bloody mess. It's such a dominant strategy on normal mode that it made the game sort of boring. And in a weird way, I enjoyed playing on easy mode more, as spamming attacks wasn't always punished, and it led me to dominate the battlefield more often, but at least I was doing so in a stylish samurai way, instead of just parrying and slashing, parrying and slashing, parrying and slashing over and over and over. The power of parrying cripples any flexibility the combat system may have had, and despite efforts to switch things up, the player is going to feel a sense of repetitiveness. Trek to Yomi introduces variants like enemies with ranged attacks, or yokai that summon spirits, or spear-wielding enemies with an expanded range, or a boss fight, or running sections where the player must dodge arrows or soldiers on horseback, and there's also warriors that have extra combo attacks. It sounds like a lot, but none of these really feel like both substantial and unique inclusions. And it all just comes back to parry and strike. The combos you unlock are good on paper, but were confusing to execute, and not as effective as simple slashes in my experience. To me, the most broken move was facing away from enemies, rolling backwards, and spamming a turnaround combo that shredded enemy health. I spammed that move a lot, but at least it was better than parry and strike. Of course, the most powerful moves in the game really didn't end up being those combos. They ended up being ranged attacks in the form of shurikens, arrows, and shotgun blasts. I used these on tough enemies, but man did it feel weird to do so every single time. Nothing screams honorable Bushido code like blasting the final boss in the face with arrows and cannonballs. I mean, seriously, I'm stunned that they included these as options given how obvious detractors they are from a story about samurai honor and duty. But because of these factors, the combat system ended up feeling passable but not exciting in most instances. One-on-one encounters with strong foes were the highlight, but they were too few and far between, as instead we got a lot of endless waves of the same enemies. It just wasn't my cup of tea. And outside of combat, you'll usually just be collecting hidden upgrades throughout the levels. I mean, occasionally you'll be asked to solve the simplest of puzzles, but it's done so sparingly throughout the game that I'm not even sure why they included it, or if it's even worth talking about. I guess they were passable as pace changes, but seriously, nothing to excite the player. With all of this taken into consideration, we're left with a game that's confused on its priorities. Does it want movie-like angles, or a player-friendly camera? Does it want the multiple endings a game can offer, or the definitive resolution of a movie? How can it provide a movie-like experience while also having bugs that take away from the presentation? Does it want to flow like a movie, or challenge the player with tough combat leading to respawns and repeated moments? Does it want to tell a gripping, cinema-quality story, or just have the look of one? It's all of these factors that make Trek to Yomi such a perplexing experience, despite how cohesive it looks on paper. That heavy art direction really does build that cohesion, but a deep dive reveals a game that can't hold up under the weight of that presentation and art direction. It provides moments of beauty, but also cripples much of the experience you'd anticipate having while playing a video game. And really, the story isn't that good either. So the end result is an average game that never really offers anything substantial to the player, as instead it's too caught up checking itself out in the mirror, admiring all of its presentational elements. While attempting to provide the best of both the movie world and the gaming world, Trek to Yomi fails to deliver either, resulting in a flat and ultimately forgettable game. Thanks for watching. So here we are at the end of this video. Yeah, I didn't really like this game, but I also didn't hate it. I can see how some people would like it, it just really wasn't for me. I'd much sooner recommend a game like Sekiro Shadows Die Twice or Ghost of Tsushima over this title. But if you're short on time or really dig Kurosawa films, I guess feel free to check this one out. It's not a terrible game by any means, but it certainly was a puzzling one to me. And if you're interested in reading the full interview with Menchiari, the creator of this game, you can find it linked in the description below. Anyway, if you're new to the channel and you like what you see, please go ahead and subscribe. I'm really trying to reach 1,000 subs by the end of the year, so I'm really hopeful that we can get there. We're on pace for it, and it would just be awesome, and it would mean a lot if we could do it. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp. And as always, guys, have a nice day and take care.